wonder if you'd like to respond to Steven at this stage.
Well, yeah, I found out that I was really interested by what you took out of it, and that aspect that you focus on is, I think, an extraordinarily important one. Maybe it's the most interesting part of the whole thing, you know. And I was really, well, one of the things that I was thinking about as I listened to you was a few years ago, now it's been maybe about a decade, you know, Jürgen Habermas came out with this small book. Well, it was a collection of essays, and its title was more or less The Post-National Constellation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his great concern at that time, when as the European Monetary Union had just been completed, was how do you create in a political unit so big as the European Union a sense of solidarity among people who don't have shared histories and a shared language. And so he developed, and he started to point to the existence of transnational social movements of the kind that had been unfolding in Europe for only a relatively short time, and which were intensifying at that very moment, as a source of experience where people could learn to imagine that person whom they don't know, who their money would go to. In other words, they would have the feeling of solidarity that would be the basis for the legislation of redistribution, you know? This kind of conversation has obviously disappeared from the airwaves, from the you know, newspaper editorial columns and so on, in favor of a conversation that's really reduced to the national scale, and above all, and then sometimes, you know, the territorial scale, like around, if you want to get into the conversations around Antwerp and their lovely parties they have there, and then the intimate scale. And, you know, I was really struck when the first night I was here. Okay, I'm very hungry. I go to eat some Chinese food, a small restaurant here in Eindhoven, and as I eat, there's a TV, of course, that's on. It's on American reality TV in English. And the Chinese girl who served me the food is watching the birth of the baby of the American couple. And as each moment from the birth onward happens in these people's lives, every time an event happens, there's great applause by crowds of people. And you have this like intimacy being beamed in from halfway around the world into the experience of this person. And I found it really extraordinary. And then following my usual practice in these sorts of moments, I went to the coffee shop next door. And in the coffee shop, you had an amazing media display. You had, on the one hand, the Dutch version of reality TV, which is without the applause and a little more boy meets girl sort of thing. And then on the other screen, because they have two and everyone has flat screen TVs everywhere now, you could see the American Discovery Channel with the footage of the latest missiles and jet planes taking off from the desert, the very desert floor that Trevor Paglen photographs from distances of 30 miles or so. And what has not happened is that we haven't developed the vocabularies, the interests, the aesthetic figures, the actual experiences to even discuss anymore that European scale, which was erected in the hopes, and with a double hope, with the one hope of creating a massive free trade market, and then with the other hope, which together comprised the European project, of making a place in the world where it would be possible to have more peace and less chaos. And that conversation has been driven out of the you know, public sphere, as it were, or along with the public sphere itself, I would say, by the kind of things that you're talking about, where even, you know, intimacy itself becomes something that's commodified. No. So I think it's really, so I think there you could see that there is a mission for the cultural institution, which is to create the possibility to perform, for everyone to perform these shifts in scale that would alleviate the generation of a tremendous social unconscious, which is what we are generating now, especially as political discussion is confiscated by these means which are calculated for the maximum effect with the minimum of awareness of what, you know, what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think that... is it
please,
is that what the scenes that you describe are, I think, exemplary of the kind of extremely complex hybridity in which we are all the time, let's say embedded or drenched, and let's say it seems almost like the easy way out is then to reduce everything to sort of immediate senses and then a sort of immediate response to that. And that's what is somehow left behind is the, let's say, sort of the sort of communal aesthetic act that we have to perform in learning to deal with this hybridity. And this is in a way also how sort of I translated this idea of the extradisciplinary space or a practice into a let's say a place that, let's say, in being outside of discipline, so sort of trying to move away from this idea of only, let's say, providing one disciplinary product in the end, is that you have this, that maybe the site where we are communal beings at the moment is an extraterritorial or an extra-disciplinary space, and that we have to be much more, let's say, aware of the fact that let's say, occupying that space takes a lot of let's say, training, or in any case, let's say, playful training and experiment in trying to refine the language that you use there, because otherwise you just always go back to sort of default position that is sort of the language of sort of simple advertising, something like that.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. You know, the only thing is I wouldn't call it a space. It's interesting. I've heard that several times, an extradisciplinary space. For me, it's a relation, and it's a relation which actually brings two disciplines together, where one doesn't have, there isn't this claim that I'm free from disciplines and you are not, or we are going to have this free space, which would be, but it's rather, if there is an outside, it's generated by the fact that there's more than one, and so that each becomes the outside of the other one. Not an outside as a free space, but the outside as difference, you know, as a difference in the way that an effort is channeled into shaping what the world is going to be, and the reasons why that effort is channeled, and the codes according to which it's channeled. And so the outside is generated in the relation. So for me, it's more of a relation than a space. But that goes even more in the direction of what you're saying, because what you're saying is, I mean, what would be the communalism of a complex society? Of a, you know, this is why we tried and failed, I think, in France to generate and really make this concept of the multitude, because we wanted to indeed get at what would be the forms of social relation when you can't presuppose and you don't want to presuppose the inherent identity of the people involved in that relation. In other words, when you really wanted to have a relation where it's differences that are together rather than togetherness that is together, or identity that's together.
Talking about relations, building relations, are there any? Are there any comments or questions? It would be nice to sort of assemble a few comments and questions from the floor, so you can raise your hand and. Armin, thank you very much. I'll ask a few people to talk, and then we'll come back to the panel. Armin, and then Galit, and then someone here?
I can ask.
No? Someone at the
just a short comment about this question that you brought up about art's role. In my own observation recently, I mean, the sort of practices that I like, what I think what they are doing is to create critical publics around many things, around many different themes, and it has to do also with the sort of failure of the media sphere. I don't say there's a total blackout. You know, the media systems are different in different countries, but in most European countries you would have in so-called mainstream media, you would still find the odd good documentary, the odd good discussion, and so on. It's not a total blackout, but by and large there's a failure to address a lot of the sort of topics and to address them in their multiplicity and diversity. And art is doing that. It's not big publics, it's creating many little critical publics, and that's, I think, maybe a good argument in that debate.
Galit, do you want to comment, and then we can come back here?
Yes, I have some questions and some remarks. I must say I'm a bit confused. I'm feeling that I'm sitting in front of a smoke screen. I'm not sure if we're talking about art tactic or strategies, art strategies, or we try to analyze the world, how it's function, or we're talking about the cuts in the Netherlands, are they all connected? Are we really need to, with the cuts, I agree, it's bad. But do really art need support money? Can art couldn't exist without it? And we talk about public. We didn't left this idea of public of art. We don't have a public. Maybe a few communities. Maybe we will start to talk about things and call them with a name. And I must say, Brian, if I can comment about your talk, I don't know if it's really important for me, for us to learn about new art tactics, which are not new. So most of the work that you showed dealing with data processing, which comes from music, developed to the visuals. There is kind of tradition through Max MSP, to Jitter, to other kind of way how to read data, and in parallel to paperclip scientists and the way that Second World War kind of intervene in our reality with controlling the masses, controlling the brain, creating obedience, disobedience, and etc. And different kind of military, but not only military. You know, if NASA is also military, but we see it in all the range of culture. Which one of, I think, the most prominent. So I'm not sure what we are really talking about, and it is important to talk about art strategies instead of to talk about the world. It's really important to talk about theory without really to look at the things and to learn from them. So I feel a bit kind of that I think I'm watching, like you talk about the reality show, but I think I'm watching now a parallel reality, and I don't know to which one I need to be related. Mm-hmm. I will start with this. I think it's enough for now.
You're certainly watching a parallel reality. Our realities are undoubtedly on those kind of parallel tracks, which only meet if you look at a very long distance down the line. Where the space somehow curves, I would say. To get a little less smokescreen in my response, I presented a way of looking at certain artistic strategies whereby the artistic strategy itself becomes a vehicle towards cultural critique. Cultural critique is no longer about an artistic strategy. It is about assessing the way in which society is shaped by those who live in it, and particularly by those who have accumulated the power to gain, to actually shape certain aspects of society. And then it's particularly about identifying the groups who give the major orientations to society. This is what cultural critique is about. And then asking the question, do we want to live like that? Okay? So when you do that, there are many ways to do that. One of the ways is to look through the lens of, through the range of sensory and expressive possibilities that's created by particular artistic projects, which are not just objects, but which are processes that have objects along the way, okay? And so I tried to show some of the artistic strategies come in there. Now, is it necessary to talk about them?
Strategies or
yes.
Tactics?
Oh, strategies or tactics, I don't really care. These
I
are
think
artistic
it's important.
practices. You think it's important, but I'm not
in relation to
particularly.
power.
Well, I think that there are different, I don't want to get into the discussion, that's all. But I do think that that is one way to approach cultural critique. Is it necessary to approach cultural critique through the artistic process? No, I don't think so. However, I think it's, personally, I think it's desirable, and I also think that it's particularly appropriate to a mission of a museum to see how you could do cultural critique both with the activities that are, have to do with the mission of the museum, but trying to go beyond this sort of closure around the art object in and of itself and for itself. And this is therefore my thing. Now, if you already know all of that, and you already know everything, then that's fine. You can also leave. That's really true. I mean, I believe that if one is already far beyond the situation that is being described, then sleep is a possibility.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for this inspiring lecture.
Can Steven quickly respond, Mahmoud, and then to you?
Yeah, and so on. No, I think that, let's say if you say, okay, what does this have to do, let's say, how does this sort of immense or this vast representation or theoretical articulation of the world today, how does it relate in the end back to let's say something as mundane as the budget cuts here? Is that I think that the budget cuts are interesting in that they manifest the inability of this particular society to articulate its publicness, and that art, let's say, in modern society has always been very, let's say, strong or very closely related to the idea of publicness and how you can, let's say, playfully articulate that. And then I think especially, let's say, of Schiller's letters on aesthetics and also the way in which Ranger talked about that. But what I think is interesting is that Schiller, and in a way Ranger sort of returned to that, is said that let's say a modern type of society that tries to sort of disseminate power through its, let's say, individual constituents has to constantly deal with the fact that these people, they are embedded in a process that they cannot fully understand, and they at a certain point manifest their discontent in first only a sign that is unreadable by the rest, and then this sign then becomes translated into speech and then, let's say, can be taken up into discourse. And that to be able to do that, you need to, let's say, you need to be able to, on the one hand, talk with each other and to be able to, let's say, discuss together what you think is important together. And on the other hand, you cannot hope that there will one day be a place where this language will be so profound and so perfect that, let's say, every problem that emerges will immediately be translatable into, let's say, available concepts. But that this is a very messy process in which all the time, let's say, things appear and become visible or become, let's say, an experience. And then this sort of almost intimate and private experience has to be somehow translated into the public, into the political. And I think that if somehow this idea of this translation, let's say this learning or this education into how to translate your own sensible, let's say your own sensible experience into this sort of bigger political domain, if this, let's say, is as it is sort of now, sort of separated and becomes a private game, like, okay, we can be extremely virtuoso in doing a certain, let's say, game of sensations, and then the rest of society will do the rest. And in society there will be all, let's say, these small little units that are very good in what they do. Then I think art has become one product among the others and has lost its, let's say, its possibility and its potential in trying to be the site where you can, let's say, bridge between, or let's say, in that sense, then say, where relations can be formed. And so in that sense, I think that, let's say, the inability to address this public nature of art in the current discussion about the budget cuts is an interesting manifestation of a certain, let's say, problem that I think is really a problem. And that has then to do in, let's say, in reading your text, let's say you're listening to your lecture, on the difficulty that we have in living in all these different layers at the same time. So this is why I try to really bring it back to something that's very let's say, that's very in our face at the moment, but which I think is really related. I don't think it's like an artificial push to say that these budget cuts, in that sense, relate to your, let's say, trying to comprehend the situation.
Not at all. I mean, that the reason for studying the way that the neoliberal formation is developed and for not thinking that one formation just replaces another is to see exactly the dynamics of social change. What's happened in Europe is that people say the welfare state disappeared. It did not disappear in Europe. In no European country where it was actually established, and that excludes Spain and Italy where you don't really have a welfare state, everywhere it was established, it didn't disappear. It underwent slow processes of change. And so I study that in my work. Actually, it was difficult for me to study that through an artistic lens, so I just decided not to. I decided to just outright study it. But I think that kind of process of social change is exactly what interests me in terms of a practitioner of cultural critique. To see how it is that we have made capacities to shape our own destiny, and then how it is that we lose those capacities. And I actually think that one has at each historical turning to invent new ones. And the idea that you should hold on forever to the old ones, what you should hold on to is the ideals of the old ones, the purpose that they were supposed to serve, but not the forms which no longer serve that purpose. But to do all that, you have to at least first describe what those ideals have been, what those forms have been, describe the conditions under which they undergo change, and describe the moment of crisis where it's really obvious that this is now a dispute and no longer sort of a simmering concern, you know. And that's several of the ambitions of.
And also maybe I can pick up one point that Stephen made, which I mean, it's really a sort of, in a way, a personal experience, but I think it's shared by a number of people, that this history of not being able to articulate the public interest of art, or this fact of not being able to articulate the public interest of art here, has a certain history. I think it has a history which I've observed, at least over the last 6 years in the Netherlands, developing. And I think it goes back further. And it's a history where, on the one hand, art was premised on the basis of economic and tourist development. This building, for instance, was basically supported, and demand for money was generated, partly on the basis of there's a lot more work in the collection, so therefore we need a bigger space, but partly also on the idea that this would generate some tourist or economic potential. And I think that argument, which here was weaker than it is now, is also reiterated by many of the defenders of the cuts. In other words, the culture feeds the economy. Now, I think that order is extremely problematic. Surely we make money in order to build culture. I mean, otherwise, why do we make profit? What is the motivation for profit? It's in order to live. That can be, even to the capitalist, the idea is that it's good to make profit so that people then get wages. I mean, of course, it's not true. You know, they're looking after themselves. But fundamentally, there's a destination for this profit, which is not in itself, but which is built on other, or at least potentially could be built on other value systems, and not only money for its own sake. And I think that the fact that the cultural sector has abandoned the argument in which art might be based on, in some way on a cultural ground, on an economic ground, which then feeds it, is something which now comes back in the arguments that art does not need public support because it should be economically self-sustainable. And I think the other thing, and this is again the question that I see certainly in the Netherlands, but perhaps in other countries as well, has developed, is that there hasn't been a real social base on which institutions like this have been built for some time. In other words, that the social base, which was previously the local bourgeoisie, fundamentally, you know, Meneer van Abbe was the local bourgeoisie who founded this institution, and it was very clear with the name of this institution what its social base was. It was him and his friends in Eindhoven who wanted to reproduce an institution that they'd seen probably in Amsterdam, perhaps in Brussels, perhaps in a few other cities, and they wanted to reproduce it on the local level. It was a reproduction of that because they couldn't travel so much. Now that bourgeoisie has to some extent transformed not entirely, but to some extent it's become internationalized. In other words, for the Henry van Abbes of today, the family of which now live in Zurich, but they're also traveling around all over the world, and they would just as easily go to a museum in Rome or in Istanbul as they would go to a museum in wherever they happen to be located now. So, and is there a new social base, and this is a question I think for us, is there a new social base which we can identify and build upon as an institution when that old social base has to some extent gone? Of course, it hasn't entirely collapsed, that's why we're still standing here. But I don't think it's as strong as it was in 1936 when Meneer van Abbe, and I don't think it's even as strong as it was in 1989. So I think that process of losing a social base and at the same time resorting not to finding a new social base, as that declines, but using the arguments of economy and tourism, which is economy by another name, to justify the institutions while they're growing enormously and spending more and more public money, is something that's come to, you know, as you would say in a way, come to a sort of logical crisis formation with this current condition. And we need, and this is where I think it comes back to Brian, we need another vocabulary of why art is significant in the public realm. We need to have another vocabulary in order to present that vocabulary as an argument for our continued subsidy. If we want to continue the subsidy, which I think from Gali is a legitimate question, that maybe we don't need that subsidy, but I think that at the moment we need to at least try and present arguments that we believe in, that are not simply self-serving and about protecting our own jobs, but we believe in, so that we can justify the kind of money, or even less money, but nevertheless justify that money that is being injected from the taxpayers.
Wait a minute, there was a question.
Yeah, Mahmoud, sorry. And then...
Sorry.
Thank you for this lectures. Sorry if I will change a little bit the direction of the talk, but your talk reminded me of like when a new scientist finds a new approach or tools to observe an experiment. So by having this new tool, then he can see a new scale which was hidden, and then it allows him to make much more progress in his field. And if I will take this argument of science, science is blind. It never had a moral directions. And this artistic device, if I will speak about it, which I didn't hear anything about the usage of this artistic device. And can such an artistic device regulate itself? Can it really always stay within a directions which can be just and can be right? Can it help to create or help to create a society of justice, or to show and differentiate between what is right and what is wrong? Or is it simply one of these tools which can again be used by any of the corporate, and you what all your work you did, like someone from a company can read your work and then again use it to generate more money? So simply what you did is nothing to criticize them, but actually to help them and empower them. And I'm curious if you can find an answer.
No, of course. Of course, this is something that not only do I think about, that I explicitly think about. I mean, the text that the title of the symposium was taken from by the organizers, not by myself. The text called "The Artistic Device" goes exactly into what you just said, with the proposal that, beginning with Foucault's idea of the panopticon, where he coined this notion of the dispositif, or the device. He said, okay, here's a social machine called a prison. It's structured in a very particular way. It's round. There's a tower in the center, and the tower has rooms, glass windows, which all have sort of blinds, so you can't really see if anyone's in there. However, the people in there can clearly see into the cells, which themselves don't even have windows. They have bars, and it's transparent. Okay, so he said this is a device not just for holding people in a prison, it's for changing their minds and their bodies. It's for making them docile. It's for causing them to internalize the law. So that then would be a device whose real material, the material on which it operates, is human beings. Now what I propose in the text on the artistic device is that we live in a world that's full of such devices, and that in our contemporary period, where the economy is so much about words and images, it's about concepts, but it's also about images. It's also about slogans. So much of this cultural production is really involved in the economic development of the society, that the artistic devices sometimes can have as coercive an effect on people as the prisons did in the past. And so I bring out examples of corporations, and this is where it gets exactly what you're saying, of corporations who give you formulas, for instance, for taking what's done in the theater and theatricalizing the relationship to the product that's portrayed not only in the advertisement, but in places like the restaurant or the museum or wherever, where people are going to consume. And so they're using, and what you're saying is therefore precisely exactly what's done in the world. You've got it. So people are doing that, and they're doing that sort of all over the place, as they say. You find it everywhere. You find that when the government wants to make a new system of sanitation in the city, that they dress up people in blue costumes looking like flowing water, and they all go around with cleaning things to dramatize the fact that the city's getting a new sewer system. And they do much more subtler things than that. They create programs that are supposed to orient your attention in one way or the other. They create spaces of play where this kind of play is supposed to... So, and this sort of condition of society, I think, is inherent to society. I mean, there are some of these programs I really dislike, but I don't think one can escape entirely from such a social condition, because that's kind of what human beings do. And precisely because we can't agree all the time, many of these devices are very much artistic, because it looks like in the space of fantasy we might agree a little more. And we might agree for purposes that someone has designed. So I think that the artistic device is ambiguous, and I do think that it's very interesting and important to particularly design devices that will be the most, where the rules of the game will be the most transparent possible, where the possibility of people to create inputs that were not pre-written into those rules is the largest possible, where the likelihood of people creating another game out of the basis of that one, either to contest it, or to get rid of it, or to improve it, or simply because they're finished with their game, is the highest. I think that this is something that actually corresponds to what art should do in a democratic society, or what art could do in a democratic society. And I don't think that one always needs to have the government out there funding that, because in my observation, the governments often and increasingly fund things that serve their purposes. So I think that creating these sort of devices is up to, first of all, to the people who create them, and it's also up to a kind of culture of noticing, there's an interesting device. Now, I may not want to imitate that device, I may not want to reproduce it once or massively, but I do admire the quality of that device, because it has set up a relationship between people that's going to generate at once more solidarity and more freedom, and both of those at the same time, than the usual artistic device that might be, for instance, this lecture, or this TV program, or etc.
Can I consider Wikipedia and YouTube a very democratic, critical tools to understand contemporary society? Can I look to it like it is actually just providing you with the information, and then you yourself decide of what to do, and nothing like that you do it in top-bottom approach, but it is really bottom-up approach? Can you look to Wikipedia and YouTube as an alternative of critique of cultures?
Well, I've been very interested in all those developments on the internet precisely because they offered a more grassroots, more multiple way of creating things, and so I participated in a lot of projects. You know, I use Wikipedia about 10 times a day usually, so I happen to like that one. You know, I made critique, and therefore the answer to that is simply yes. I would say you can. I think it's interesting to do. I mean, I tried to analyze some such projects in some earlier writing when those things were a little were being actually invented as you know, I was writing about them, and that was pretty interesting, and it still is. And there's a lot of, that's something that's been done pretty well here in the Netherlands. You know, it's not as interesting as it used to be, but there's a whole community of people around a mailing list called NetTime, and basically that's what that whole list is about. People are analyzing things like that every day, and there are other, that was a very generative matrix, and it gave rise to many other things around the world. And so yeah, that's one of my sports, is to analyze such things. I mean, I happen to prefer Wikipedia over YouTube, but I still, you know, I have never written about YouTube itself, but you can.
Gabriella?
Yeah, I have to go back to...
Can we get the microphone so we can record it?
I have to go back to what you said, but somehow it relates, of course. Cutting subsidies and fighting them is one thing, but we have to understand that cutting the subsidies is more than just something that is driven by economy. It's a cultural war as well. I mean, it should be understood in these terms, also from the other side, I think. And that is not acknowledged enough, I think, from the cultural side. That's all I wanted to say, but it is important, and I'm interested in knowing what the arguments and what the motives are from, let's say, the right-wing political sphere to fight that war and use the subsidies. I mean, it's crap. It's not much money. It's not something they really have to do. They only do it to prove something and to fight something.
This There's a really good book out that concerns the American university, but which you could apply very much to this question. It's called The Unmaking of the Public University, or rather, Unmaking the Public University, the title. And in the book, the theory of this man, the author of the book, is that what were called the culture wars in the early 90s, the late 80s and early 90s, were in fact the spearhead of the larger strategy which has been the unmaking of the public university. At stake in the in this war against the versions of a multi-cultural set of education and leisure institutions, his idea is that the basis of that is to give people of many different origins a chance to ground themselves in the creation of a subjectivity which they could not only know but prove to be as rich as that of the other people surrounding them. And so that if you are someone of working class origins or of Mexican origins or whatever, you too can aspire to have as much of a standing in society as your neighbors or as the people with whom you work, and so on and so on and so on. And so the author of this book thinks that if there were culture wars, and there were really wars, it's because what they wanted to stamp out was that possibility of a radically democratic society that institutes this capacity to make itself more egalitarian with every passing generation, and does so on the basis of a necessary multiplication of the cultural materials that are out there. And so he paints this picture, and then there's that as one phase of it, and the other phase of it is the transformation of the standards on which things are measured in the universities. He says if you look at how a university department judged its own production, it did not judge it in economic terms. It judged it, and was supposed to judge it, according to the terms which are developed in the discipline. And therefore, in something like literature, of course you have endless disputes about that, and those terms, those measurements, the measurements of what is valuable, change with time and according to the consensus of people who don't agree at first. So it's not an easy consensus. He says that was replaced with the notion of excellence. And since excellence, coming from a business point of view, and since actually no one had made any theory at all about how to measure excellence, what this was actually doing was importing the way that businesses measure excellence, and that is by profitability. And since the only things in the university that were profitable were those which interested the businesses, and that has to do with broadly those things which are productive in design and so on, and of course the techno-scientific applications. And so now we have a situation where in the United States they want to cut the subsidies to the universities, giving the universities the excuse to cut out all those troubling things that are called the humanities. Now that, I think, is political. When you explain it that way, it is a war. And it's a war which isn't just about a few dollars or a few euros. It's a war that's about what influence on the development of society will its institutions, its cultural institutions, actually have. And would it not be better, from a certain perspective, to simply get rid of those cultural institutions and to recreate culture as something which is only accessed by the upper classes, who of course need it, not only to create their social status, but to create the superior agility of their minds and feelings, so they are able to govern and control the society. That's the thesis of unmaking the public university.
But I think there's also an interesting, to sort of bring it to the, exactly to support it, I think, but to bring it to the Dutch level, is the history of Studium Generali, I think is quite interesting, which is this general studies program, which was introduced in Dutch universities after the Second World War. I mean, you know this better than me, but it was introduced with a very specific ideological motive, which is similar to the ideological motives we saw in the F scale measures. That actually, to reduce the F scale measures, the tendency to fascism, because what they found is technologists, or do you call it technicians or whatever, scientists in the Dutch universities felt no difference between an NSB government and the previous government. They were simply doing their job, and whatever was happening in the political sphere was irrelevant to them. And what happened was that Studium Generali was meant to encourage a sense of responsibility which was wider than to their own discipline. So it wasn't yet extra-disciplinary, but it encouraged the idea that there was a civic responsibility which was different from your disciplinary responsibility. And I think that is interesting because it wouldn't surprise me if at some point, relatively soon, that element of the curriculum in Dutch university, I think we should be attentive to it, yeah? When we hear that being spoken about, why do we do Studium Generale? Is it something which is cost effective? Is it something which we can economically...
It's already in question.
So I mean, if we start hearing that directly from PVV politicians and then VVD, who are basically following them, if we start to hear that, then I think we start maybe to get even a further indication, we can sort of use it a little bit to say, okay, now we know it's happening, it's the next step. Yeah? It's the next step unfolding at that point. Maybe it's already happened and I don't know about it. But. Are there any more questions? Or there will be lots of time tomorrow as well to talk to Brian and Armin, who's just disappeared as well, and Angela Melitopoulos, who will be arriving, we hope, from Cologne in the morning. So I'd just like to once again thank Brian and thank Steven as well for a great response. And invite you all to come back at 2 o'clock tomorrow for Armin Medosch and more about the economics behind a lot of this thinking. Thank you very much indeed.